So 2 Samuel chapter 6, and we're going to read the whole of this chapter. David again brought together out of Israel chosen men, 30,000 in all. He and all his men set out from Bala of Judah to bring up from there the ark of God, which is called by the name of the Lord Almighty, who is enthroned between the cherubim that are on the ark. They set the ark of God on a new cart and brought it from the house of Abinadab, which was on the hill. Uzzah and Ahio, sons of Abinadab, were guiding the new cart with the ark of God on it, and Ahio was walking in front of it. David and the whole house of Israel were celebrating with all their might before the Lord, with songs and with harps, lyres, tambourines, sistrums, and cymbals. When they came to the threshing floor of Nacon, Uzzah reached out and took hold of the ark of God because the oxen stumbled. The Lord's anger burned against Uzzah because of his irreverent act. Therefore God struck him down, and he died there beside the ark of God. Then David was angry because the Lord's wrath had broken out against Uzzah, and to this day that place is called Perez Uzzah. David was afraid of the Lord that day and said, "How can the ark of the Lord ever come to me?" He was not willing to take the ark of the Lord to be with him in the city of David. Instead, he took it aside to the house of Obed-Edom the Gittite. The ark of the Lord remained in the house of Obed-Edom the Gittite for 3 months, and the Lord blessed him and his entire household. Now King David was told, "The Lord has blessed the household of Obed-Edom and everything he has because of the ark of God." So David went down and brought up the ark of God from the house of Obed-Edom to the city of David with rejoicing. When those who were carrying the ark of the Lord had taken 6 steps, he sacrificed a bull and a fattened calf. David, wearing a linen ephod, danced before the Lord with all his might, while he and the entire house of Israel brought up the ark of the Lord with shouts and the sound of trumpets. As the ark of the Lord was entering the city of David, Michal, daughter of Saul, watched from a window. And when she saw King David leaping and dancing before the Lord, she despised him in her heart. They brought the ark of the Lord and set it in its place inside the tent that David had pitched for it. And David sacrificed burnt offerings and fellowship offerings before the Lord. After he had finished sacrificing the burnt offerings and fellowship offerings, he blessed the people in the name of the Lord Almighty. Then he gave a loaf of bread, a cake of dates, and a cake of raisins to each person in the whole crowd of Israelites, both men and women. And all the people went to their homes. When David returned home to bless his household, Michal, daughter of Saul, came out to meet him and said, "How the king of Israel has distinguished himself today, disrobing in the sight of the slave girls of his servants as any vulgar fellow would." David said to Michal, "It was before the Lord, who chose me rather than your father or anyone from his house when he appointed me ruler over the Lord's people Israel. I will celebrate before the Lord. I will become even more undignified than this, and I will be humiliated in my own eyes. But by these slave girls you spoke of, I will be held in honour." And Michal, daughter of Saul, had no children to the day of her death. Well, if you've been to Perth Museum recently, you might have seen the Stone of Destiny. You know, it's a large rectangular stone. It's considered an ancient relic. Some say it's Jacob's pillow, you know, from Genesis, where he slept and saw the stairway to heaven. whatever its origins, the value of it is in its symbolism of Scottish nationhood. Because years ago, 1,000 years ago, the old kings of Scotland were crowned on it, and it was kept at Scoonabbey. However, in the 13th century, King Edward the First, you almost feel like doing a pantomime boo at that point. King Edward the First of England came, and he took the stone away. And for the next 700 years, that stone remained in Westminster Cathedral, where various kings and queens of England and then Great Britain were crowned on it. But 30 years ago, the decision was made for the stone to return to Scotland. And so on St Andrew's Day in 1996, the stone was brought to Edinburgh amidst great fanfare and excitement. Crowds lined the Royal Mile. I think it was a Royal Marine Band that led the procession. There was horsemen, there was soldiers lining the way. There was a fly past as well, 4 jets, and there was a 21-gun salute from the castle. And then there was an official handover ceremony, and there was an awful lot of excitement as this symbolic stone was being returned, and people wondered what it meant for the nation's destiny. Now, I mention that because if you can remember it, then I know it was a long time ago, but if you can remember something of it, it gives you a little bit of the flavour that it would have been in ancient Israel when the Ark of the Covenant was coming to Jerusalem. Now, David had recently been crowned king of all Israel. He'd chased out all the Philistines. He had taken and captured Jerusalem. He made it the capital of the nation. And now he was making it the centre of religious life by bringing the Ark of the Covenant to it. Now, the Ark of the Covenant is incomparable with the Stone of Destiny, because this is no ancient relic with some sort of fuzzy story about its background. Its origins went way back to the time of the Exodus, when the Israelites came out of Egypt, when God brought Moses and the Israelites to Mount Sinai, where he made a covenant with them. He would be their God, and they in turn would be his people. Now, on that mountain, God gave them 10 commandments. He then gave them instructions to build a tabernacle, which is like a portable tent. It's a portable temple, portable temple that they could sort of carry around when they were in the wilderness. And he also gave them instructions to build an ark, which would sit in the most holy place of the temple, of the tabernacle. Now, this ark was to be built to the exact specifications that the Lord gave them. So it was to be like a large chest. It was to be made of acacia wood, and it was to be overlaid with gold. There were to be rings attached to its feet that poles could be put through, so when it was being moved, it could be carried. On top of the ark, there was the atonement cover, and this was a lid that was made out of a single piece of gold, and at either side it had cherubim, so those sort of angelic beings made out of gold that were looking towards one another with their wings sort of stretched upwards. Now, you can't really see it, 'cause it's quite a dark picture. There's an artist's depiction there of it. If you've seen Indiana Jones, you might have maybe some idea of what it might have looked like. But it's between these two cherubim with their upstretched, I said arms, didn't I? Their upstretched wings, where invisibly enthroned, God's presence was seen to dwell. Now, the ark itself, it was not divine, and the ark didn't contain God. What it did do was it signified God's presence and his reign over Israel. And it was here where Moses met with God, as the Bible says, face to face. It was so holy, no one could touch it. No one was allowed into the tabernacle to look at it except the high priest on the Day of Atonement. When it was getting moved, it got wrapped in the sort of the material of the tent and the curtain. It was a holy object. After coming into the promised land, the ark and the tabernacle, they were kept at Shiloh, which became like the religious centre of Israel during the time of the judges. And that was the way it was until the time of Eli, the priest Eli, when in an embarrassing episode for Israel, the Philistines captured the ark. Now that was humiliating for Israel, but it was even worse for the Philistines because God brought upon them plagues, and eventually the Philistines just wanted rid of the ark. And so they put the ark on a new cart. They attached a couple of cows that had just calved but had never been yoked. They sent it on its way, and the ark returned to Israel. And at that point, it was taken to the house of Abinadab, and there it seems to have remained for at least 20 years. Perhaps longer, maybe 50 or 60 years. And during this time, Saul had been made king, and it kind of slipped out of people's minds as they drifted away from the Lord. But now David was king, and he was a man after the Lord's own heart, and through him God was bringing revival to the nation. And David wanted that ark, that symbol of God's presence and his reign, to be in the nation's capital, in Jerusalem. He wanted God to be at the centre of national life. He wanted God to be at the centre of everything. And we see something of his heart there, that he was a man who was intent on worshipping the Lord. Now, unfortunately, in the move, that process of the ark going to Jerusalem was tinged with tragedy. We read here of a death of a man called Uzzah, who seems to have failed to appreciate the holiness of God. And we read also about the misery of Michal, who was too proud to bow down before the Lord. Both of them failed to appreciate the majesty of God and show him proper worship, and they suffered the consequences. And it was absolutely tragic. But we need to ask the question, what can we learn from this? What can we learn from Uzzah, from Michal, and from David and the Israelites? What can we learn about proper worship? Well, the story of Uzzah is puzzling, at least the first time we read it. Because we see there David, he got 30,000 chosen men. He got them together to escort the ark as they moved it from the house of Abinadab to Jerusalem. I've been told that it's roughly maybe 10 miles or so. That was how far they were moving it. They had a new cart made for the occasion to sit the ark upon it. They got some oxen as well. And we read about Abinadab's two sons, Uzzah and Ahio, who were guiding the cart. Ahio, he seems to have been leading the cows, and you've got Uzzah, who seems to have been in some way steadying the cart and maybe just making sure everything was as he thought, as it should be. And everyone's excited, and we're told here that everyone was sort of celebrating with all their might. They're singing songs, there's various musical instruments, and if you just sort of place yourself in the scene, it must have been really quite spectacular. Certainly it was something else. But then, in the midst of all this, when everyone's happy, tragedy strikes. The oxen stumble, the ark seems to move in some way, and so Uzzah stretches out a hand to steady the ark so it doesn't fall off the cart. And there and then, God struck him down. Why? Well, the answer is in the passage in verse 7, where we're told the Lord's anger burned against Uzzah because of his irreverent act. Therefore, God struck him down, and he died beside the ark. Now, initially, that seems perhaps harsh, yeah. But what we have to understand is that there is something fundamentally wrong about what they were doing. Besides the Old Covenant law prohibiting anyone from touching the ark, these guys weren't the right ones to be moving the ark. It was supposed to be Levites from the clan of the Kohathites who were moving it. And they shouldn't have been moving the ark on a cart either. The law of God was very specific about this. The ark, as I said earlier, had rings on the feet so that poles could go through, because when it was to be moved manually. It was to be carried on the shoulders, not to be put on a cart. So there was a fundamental problem about what they were doing when they were moving the ark. They were not following God's word. They were doing what felt right to them. They were actually just copying what the Philistines had done when the Philistines sent the ark back. Clearly no one had gone to the scriptures. No one had sought God's direction on how they should do this. Now, we can actually fill in some of the details, because in 1 Chronicles chapter 13 and chapter 15 it actually tells us a little bit more about the background and what was happening. But one of the things it tells us is afterwards, it says, David says to the Levites, it was because you, the Levites, did not bring it up the first time that the Lord our God broke out in anger against us. We did not inquire of him about how to do it in the prescribed way. Now, it's great there. David wanted worship of the Lord to be right back at the heart of national life again. But the problem was, they were doing it in their own terms. And here we see a fundamental truth about worship. That worship that is acceptable and pleasing to God must be according to his prescribed way. We can't just worship God any old way that we feel is good, or any old way that we would like. We must worship God according to his terms, not ours. Now today, we know Jesus Christ, he has fulfilled the old covenant. He's given us a new covenant. We don't require the tabernacle anymore. We don't require the Ark of the Covenant anymore. But this underlying principle about proper worship being on God's terms is fundamental to the gospel. Especially as we live in a global village, if you like, where there are many religions. UK is now a pluralistic society. Every day we see people, nice people, who practice their religion in a sincere way, in a devout way. And it has become a popular pattern of thinking that ultimately it doesn't really matter what religion that we practice. Ultimately, we're all worshipping the same sort of divine being anyway. So as long as we're sincere, as long as, we're honest about it, God will respect that. And we'll all be okay. But that view does not take into account the clearly revealed truth of God. And this is something that even the church has to know. Because even as evangelicals, we can start to slip into that pattern of thinking like the rest of the world, as long as people are sincere, as long as people are devout. Jesus said, I am the way and the truth and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. The only way that we can come to God, the only way that we can worship him acceptably is through faith in Jesus Christ. And we cannot come to him any other way, regardless of good intentions, regardless of sincerity, regardless of niceness. This is the way that God prescribes. That's the way that we are to approach him. Because only Jesus deals with our problem of sin. You see, this view that we can just come, doesn't really matter how we worship God, it does not take into consideration the fact that God is holy. And we have a problem with sin. And it's only Jesus Christ that's dealt with that problem of sin. And he did that when he died on the cross. So Hebrews chapter 10 tells us we have been made holy through the sacrifice of the body of Jesus Christ once and for all. He is that once and for all sacrifice. Only he can make us holy. Only through faith in him can we approach God and worship him acceptably. Now, this moving of the ark without due consideration to the word of God, this was a painful lesson for David. We're told that he got angry. I'm not quite sure why. Maybe he was angry with Uzzah for foolishly touching the ark. Perhaps he was angry with God because God had maybe, in his view, maybe had acted quite harshly. Perhaps he was angry with himself and his own rashness. You know, he'd sought God's direction for how he should fight against the Philistines. He sought God's direction about when he should go back to Israel. He constantly sought God's direction, but he hadn't this time. And so he put the whole thing on hold. Instead, the ark was taken to the home of Obed-Edom. David, we're told, he was afraid now because I guess David, he had seen God blessing him in so many ways, but now he was actually on the receiving end and part of God's anger. And so I guess he was afraid of what might happen to him, what might happen to the people in Jerusalem should he take the ark there and inadvertently they offend God. But then he heard how the Lord had blessed the home of Obed-Edom. It changed his mind, and so he thought, right, let's get the ark back to, not back to Jerusalem, but let's get the ark up to Jerusalem. And this time he made a conscious effort to do everything according to God's law. So again, 1 Chronicles chapter 15, it records how he did that, records the names even of the people that were involved. Only Levites this time were going to be moving the ark. And they would do so using the poles so that the ark was carried on their shoulders, not in an ark. And they were to prepare themselves before they even did this. They were to consecrate themselves and make sure that everything was according to how the Lord had stipulated in his law. Only they would be playing the instruments and leading the singing. And this time, when they started, they made a sacrifice. So just after 6 steps, you know, they've got this long journey, they take 6 steps, and then they offer sacrifices. We also have this added detail that David here, he's not wearing his robes. He's wearing an ephod, a linen vest, which was the sort of garment that a priest would wear. Which makes you wonder, why was he doing that? But as someone's pointed out, it's actually quite appropriate. Israel were to be a nation of priests. So it's appropriate that the king, you know, the leader of a nation of priests, would wear one. What stands out now in this second attempt of moving the ark to Jerusalem is a respectful reverence about what they were doing. The sacred things were being treated with care. They weren't taking God for granted. They weren't presuming his favour. They weren't just doing whatever took their fancy. Now there was a real holy fear about what they were doing. And by that, I don't mean that they were all sort of snivelling wrecks, you know, hiding in terror. They had a healthy reverence towards God. You know, this healthy fear, this reverence towards the Lord is another aspect of worship that is honouring to him. You know, in Ecclesiastes, Solomon, David's son, he explores what life is about, thinking about the meaning of life and the sort of things that we pursue to try and find meaning. He talks about the passions of life, the transitory nature of life, and eventually he makes this conclusion. He says, now all has been heard, here is the conclusion of the matter. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. Fear God. And this isn't just an old covenant thing. And Peter, in his first letter, he instructs us, show proper respect to everyone, love the brotherhood of believers, fear God, honour the king. We also see it being an indicator of the health of the early church. So in Acts, when we're told about how the Lord was blessing the early church, we read, "Then the church throughout Judea and Galilee and Samaria enjoyed a time of peace. It was strengthened and encouraged by the Holy Spirit. It grew in numbers, living in the fear of the Lord." You know, one of the criticisms aimed at the church of today, the wider church of today, at times is a lack of reverent fear towards God. And maybe that is partially true. Probably comes from a downgraded view of God, where we don't think so much of the holiness of God, but it's almost like an imbalanced view of God that we have, where he's just our buddy who is there to do our bidding. Maybe we've got a cheap view of grace as well. Perhaps the smoke machines in some of the mega churches and the commercialisation, you know, of some aspects of the gospel have given justification to that criticism as well. You know, here at Hope, we have a high view of God. We do intentionally lean towards being slightly informal and relaxed in public worship. And part of the reason for that is because we've got a missional heart. But we're orderly. I'd like to think we're orderly, because that honours God. And let's be absolutely clear about this. We are serious about God. I think it's wrong to correlate the amount of starch in our clothes or the starchiness of our service to the degree that we revere God. And equally, it's wrong to assume that a smiling face means that we are not serious about God. And it's my hope, certainly, I think I'm speaking on behalf of the leadership team here by saying this. It's our hope that anyone who walks through these doors on a Sunday would pick up quickly that we are a people that revere God, that we hallow his name, that we love him. And we hope as well that would be seen by how we live our daily lives. Because worship, of course, is much more than just what we do when we gather together on a Sunday. It's whole life worship. And perhaps the thing that shows most that we don't revere God is an inconsistent life. You know, when we behave one way at church, but then the rest of the week we behave another way. Because perhaps we fear more of what folks think of us in church than we do the Lord. And we fear more of what people say of us outside than we do of the Lord. I've already mentioned smiles. I think traditionally in Scotland we've had a problem with smiles. Maybe it's connected with the weather, I don't know. But somehow we seem to think or fall into this pattern of mindset that smiling is somehow unspiritual. But that's so wrong. That's so wrong. In Philippians we're commanded, rejoice in the Lord always. I will say it again, rejoice. I mean, can you really rejoice without the occasional smile, breaking out? Joyful, wholehearted worship is absolutely pleasing to the Lord. And here we see David was rejoicing. The Levites were told they were singing. The people were singing. They're shouting. Trumpets blowing. They were celebrating. We're told with all their might. And we've got David leaping and dancing about. It was an occasion of joy. It was an occasion of celebration. And there's a real sense of a sort of sanctified carnival atmosphere here, where finally, the ark was being brought to Jerusalem, and we're told there's more sacrifices, there's more burnt offerings, there's fellowship offerings, which is interesting because Levitical law fellowship offerings were the offerings that people then received back and enjoyed. David, we're told, he blessed the people in the name of the Lord, Everyone knew this was about God. And then they're returning to their homes. Each one's given, we're told, a loaf of bread, a cake of dates, a cake of raisins. I mean, can you just actually imagine what it was like that night? You know, families returning to their homes. You've got husbands and wives, you know, sort of chirping away to one another. You've got the kids are buzzing. The elderly have this new energy. You know, people are laughing. Folks are feeling this is good times. And folks are going to bed, you know, going to sleep with smiles on their faces. Now, obviously, this wasn't an everyday thing that was happening. This was the ark coming to Jerusalem. Clearly, David was a passionate guy as well, and I think it's fair to say that we wouldn't all freely be able to leap and dance in our vest, or maybe are comfortable at doing so. I'm sure a few hamstrings would go in the process. What it all points to, though, is joyful, wholehearted worship of God. And it does make you wonder, what would celebrating with all our might look like for us? Maybe those who can remember VE Day, or who have at least seen the pictures, might be able to remember something of that celebration. You know, a sense of elation, a sense of joy. I think we have to recognise, though, as well, as it's quite tough sometimes to celebrate with all our might in this world when things are going wrong, or in our own lives, you know, when times are hard. Well, just consider this. David and the Israelites, they were celebrating because that symbol of God's presence and God's reign was being brought to Jerusalem. Now, what we have to keep in mind is that one day, God's immediate presence and his visible reign is going to be seen when he returns, when he reigns in the New Jerusalem. And he's assured us, he's promised us that through Jesus Christ, we are going to be there. That's the certain hope. A hope that can't be taken away, even in difficult times. And it's that hope that helps us, even when our hearts are heavy, you know, to rejoice inwardly. To know that those eternal joys are going to more than compensate for any trials that we're going through just now. Not everyone was smiling, of course. We've got Michal, the daughter of Saul, was not happy. When the ark entered Jerusalem, she saw David leaping and dancing before the Lord. She despised him. She'd been raised a princess, and here she's behaving like the proverbial princess. She's too high and mighty to think that what David was doing was in some way appropriate. When he returned home, and he's coming home, probably he's beaming, you know, he's in high spirits. And she's met with him, who probably gave him the stink eye, you know, looked at him up and down, and then said with scathing words, how the king of Israel has distinguished himself today, disrobing in the sight of the slave girls of his servants as any vulgar fellow would. You sense the bitterness there, don't you? And David's response is so good. He's not celebrating for her, he's not celebrating for anyone else, he's celebrating before the Lord, the same Lord who'd chosen him to be king over anyone in her house. It wasn't the robes that made him king, it was God. And he would worship God with all his heart, becoming even more undignified, even more humiliated in his own eyes. And he didn't care about that because he had an audience of one, and that was God. And far from being scorned by these slave girls, he knew that ultimately they would look at him because they knew that he had an authentic, humble heart. He actually considered these slave girls who had that attitude were of more noble heart than she was. Quite a contrast between the pride of Michal and the humility of David, and it reminds us of the contrast between her father Saul and David. It's interesting, 3 times she's referred to here as the daughter of Saul. of all the things that she could despise him for, taking other wives, for instance, breaking up her other relationship, taking the crown from her house, of all the things that she could have hated him for, it was for his humility before the Lord. And the result of that was that the Lord withheld blessing from her. There'd be no heir from the union of the house of David and the house of Saul. That curse to the house of Saul would be fulfilled in its fullest. And David here, his humility in derobing before God, again, it can't help us think about the humility of the greater king that he points to, who derobed himself of the glory of heaven and came into this world. The servant king, who sets us an example of the humility that we should follow, even in how we worship God. Because again, when we approach God, we don't come thinking in our hearts, God should be privileged to have us worship him. We come to him simply clothed in the righteousness of Christ, the only way that we can come to him. We come to him with empty hands, knowing that we've got nothing to boast about, because everything that we have that is of any value, any merit before God, comes from God by his grace. We completely and utterly depend upon him, and therefore a heart of humility is entirely appropriate. As someone once said, a man or a woman is never so tall as when they bow before the Lord. And actually we come the full circle here, because it's essentially pride which says that we will worship God however we feel is right. It's quite a chapter, isn't it? Beyond the tragic deaths of Uzzah and the misery of Michal, we see a people and a king celebrating with all their might before the majesty of God. And we learn from this that worship that is pleasing to the Lord is worship that's on his terms. Through faith in Jesus Christ, with reverent hearts, joyful, wholehearted hearts, and with humility. Let's pray.